Once again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
For years, royal insiders believed Prince William would wait patiently, carefully preserving every delicate balance inside the monarchy. But behind palace walls, a very different story was unfolding. A decision had already been made, a decision so unexpected that even senior aides reportedly struggled to believe it. When William finally took his first decisive step as the future king, the shockwaves raced through the royal family, leaving one branch completely unprepared for what was coming next. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For months, anticipation had been growing around what William's future reign might look like. Publicly, he appeared measured, disciplined, and committed to continuity. He rarely revealed his hand, rarely hinted at the deeper plans reportedly taking shape behind closed doors. Yet those closest to the center of royal operations had begun noticing subtle changes. Conversations were becoming more focused, reviews were becoming more frequent. Questions were being asked about arrangements that had existed for years without challenge. What seemed routine at first soon began raising eyebrows among those accustomed to the palace's carefully maintained traditions. Whispers spread quietly through royal circles that William was preparing something significant. Few knew the details, but many sensed that the future king was no longer content simply to inherit the institution as it stood. According to insiders, he had begun privately examining long-standing privileges, informal networks of influence, and relationships that had gradually developed around the monarchy over time. These reviews were conducted with remarkable discretion, creating an atmosphere filled with uncertainty. The less information available, the more speculation grew. And as rumors intensified, one family remained particularly confident that whatever changes might come, their position would remain untouched. That confidence would eventually become one of the story's most dramatic elements. For years, Camilla's family had become increasingly comfortable within royal circles. Many believed their connections, access, and standing had become firmly established. The assumption was simple: stability would continue. Yet beneath the surface, William reportedly viewed the future very differently. His vision for the monarchy was becoming increasingly defined by accountability, structure, and a clear separation between official duties and personal influence. It was a philosophy that quietly challenged assumptions others had come to treat as permanent realities. Senior aides reportedly noticed a transformation in William's leadership style. The cautious prince, who once preferred observation, appeared to be evolving into a figure far more willing to make difficult decisions. Those around him began speaking of a growing determination, a confidence rooted not in popularity, but in purpose. He was no longer merely preparing for a future role. He was actively shaping the foundations of that future. Every review, every private discussion, and every strategic assessment seemed connected to a larger objective that remained hidden from public view. What made the situation even more remarkable was the growing realization that this was not a temporary adjustment or a symbolic gesture. The deeper William looked into the institution he would one day lead, the more convinced he reportedly became that meaningful change was necessary. Some advisors welcomed the approach. Others worried about the consequences. Long-standing relationships could be strained. Powerful figures could feel threatened. Old tensions could resurface. Yet despite the risks, there were increasing signs that William had already reached a conclusion and was simply waiting for the right moment to act. As anticipation continued building, palace corridors became filled with speculation about what might happen next. Every new rumor seemed more dramatic than the last. Every private meeting generated fresh questions. And while the public only saw a confident future king preparing for his destiny, few realized that beneath the surface, a much larger struggle was beginning to take shape, one that would soon challenge loyalties, expose hidden divisions, and set the stage for a confrontation that nobody could easily stop. But while the public only saw a confident future king preparing for his destiny, Private conversations inside royal residences revealed a brewing conflict that had been building for years. The conflict did not begin overnight. Beneath ceremonial smiles and carefully managed appearances, tensions had quietly grown between competing visions for the monarchy's future. What seemed like minor disagreements slowly evolved into something far more serious. By the time William began asserting his authority, old loyalties, family alliances, and deeply personal grievances had created a divide that would soon explode into one of the most shocking royal power struggles in recent memory. The rumors surrounding William's future plans did not emerge from nowhere. Long before whispers of restructuring reached the public, subtle disagreements had already begun shaping conversations behind closed doors. What made the situation particularly volatile was that the dispute was never simply about policies or procedures. It was about identity, influence, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. On one side stood those who believed the institution should continue operating through relationships and traditions that had developed over many years. On the other stood William, increasingly convinced that survival in a changing world required something very different. The gap between those positions was growing wider with every passing month. At first, the disagreements appeared manageable. Small concerns surfaced during discussions about responsibilities, representation, and decision-making. Yet beneath those conversations lay deeper frustrations that many had spent years trying to ignore. Certain advisors reportedly felt that unofficial influence had become too powerful. Others argued that established arrangements were being unfairly questioned. What began as occasional disagreements gradually evolved into competing visions of royal leadership. As tensions grew, loyalty became a complicated issue. Friends found themselves on opposite sides of debates. Trusted allies began questioning one another's motives. Quiet uncertainty slowly transformed into open concern. William's growing determination only intensified the situation. The future king reportedly believed that difficult choices could no longer be postponed. He was said to be increasingly focused on creating a monarchy that appeared disciplined, transparent, and firmly centered on official duties. To supporters, this represented responsible leadership. To critics, it felt like a challenge to long-standing relationships that had become deeply embedded within royal life. Every conversation about reform seemed to trigger another disagreement. Every proposal raised new questions. The more William pushed forward, the more resistance he encountered from those who feared what might be lost in the process. Among the most sensitive topics was the growing discussion surrounding Camilla's relatives and their perceived position within royal circles. What had once been considered an uncomfortable subject gradually became impossible to avoid. Some insiders reportedly questioned whether certain privileges had expanded too far. Others insisted that these concerns were exaggerated and unfair. The debate became increasingly emotional because it touched on more than protocol. It involved family. It involved trust. It involved years of relationships built during some of the monarchy's most challenging periods. As a result, every disagreement carried personal consequences that extended far beyond official matters. Soon, palace advisors themselves appeared divided into competing camps. Some believed William's vision represented the future. Others worried that moving too aggressively could create lasting damage. Meetings reportedly became more tense. Private conversations became more guarded. Even those attempting to remain neutral found themselves drawn into the growing conflict. The atmosphere was no longer defined by uncertainty alone. It was defined by anticipation. Everyone sensed that something significant was approaching, even if few fully understood what form it would take. The emotional strain spread through relationships that had once seemed unshakable. Long-standing bonds were tested. Private frustrations surfaced. Conversations that once focused on unity increasingly revolved around disagreements and competing priorities. Yet, despite the growing resistance, William showed no sign of retreating. If anything, the conflict appeared to strengthen his resolve. The future king seemed increasingly convinced that confronting difficult questions now would prevent even greater problems later. That conviction would soon place him on a collision course with powerful interests that believed their place within royal life was secure. And as those divisions deepened, William reportedly began examining one issue that would ultimately trigger an extraordinary confrontation. What started as a routine internal review soon became something much more explosive. Documents were revisited. Privileges were questioned. Long-standing arrangements that had survived years of scrutiny suddenly found themselves under a powerful new spotlight. The deeper William looked, the more determined he reportedly became to reshape what he viewed as the monarchy's future. And with every new discovery, the possibility of a dramatic reckoning grew impossible to ignore. The divisions that had been quietly growing throughout the royal household were no longer fueled by rumors alone. William had reportedly moved beyond discussions and begun conducting an extensive examination of structures that many believed would never be challenged. What started as a review intended to assess future operations quickly expanded into something far more significant. Long-standing customs, informal agreements, and deeply rooted assumptions suddenly found themselves under careful examination. For some, this represented responsible preparation for a future reign. For others, it felt like the opening chapter of a royal revolution. As William dug deeper, attention reportedly shifted toward the invisible networks that existed alongside official royal responsibilities. These were not written rules or public policies. They were relationships, understandings, and privileges that had quietly developed over years. Supporters argued that such arrangements had helped maintain stability during difficult periods. Critics questioned whether those same arrangements had gradually created layers of influence that no longer served the monarchy's long-term interests. The deeper the review progressed, the harder those questions became to avoid. Soon, conversations that had once taken place in whispers began carrying a new sense of urgency. Questions emerged regarding access, authority, and special considerations that some individuals reportedly enjoyed. What made the situation particularly sensitive was that every answer seemed to generate even more questions. Advisors, reviewing the findings, often reached completely different conclusions. Some encouraged caution, warning that major disruptions could create lasting divisions. Others argued that delaying action would only strengthen the very problems William was attempting to address. The future king found himself surrounded by competing recommendations, yet those close to the process reportedly noticed something remarkable. Rather than becoming discouraged by disagreement, William appeared increasingly convinced that meaningful reform was necessary. That growing conviction had consequences. Family members who once felt secure began sensing that change was no longer a distant possibility. Anxiety spread quietly through royal circles. Conversations became more guarded. Reactions became more emotional. Some reportedly viewed the review as an attack on traditions they had spent years defending. Others feared that decisions made now could permanently alter relationships that had taken decades to build. The emotional weight of those concerns could not be ignored. Behind every discussion about structure or influence stood real people, struggling with uncertainty about their future place within the institution. At the center of it all stood William, increasingly determined to establish a new precedent. According to insiders, he believed the monarchy could not move forward while remaining tied to arrangements that belonged to a different era. That belief became the driving force behind every review, every meeting, and every difficult conversation. Yet the more committed he became, the more secretive the process appeared to grow. Information became tightly controlled. Speculation intensified. Even individuals with close connections to palace operations found themselves relying on rumors rather than facts. The silence surrounding the review only fueled fears that something enormous was taking shape behind closed doors. By this stage, anticipation had evolved into genuine concern. Those who dismissed earlier warnings were beginning to reconsider. Advisors spoke cautiously. Family members watched developments nervously. Long-standing assumptions about the future no longer seemed guaranteed. A growing number of people sensed that the review was approaching a turning point, one from which there would be no easy return. The question was no longer whether William would act. The question was how far he was prepared to go once he finally made his decision. Then came the moment when private discussions turned into irreversible action, catching nearly everyone off guard. The announcement landed like a thunderbolt. What many expected to remain an internal debate suddenly became a decisive act of leadership. Those who had dismissed earlier rumors quickly realized they had underestimated William's resolve. Within hours, palace corridors were reportedly filled with disbelief, frustration, and urgent conversations. The future king had drawn a line that could not easily be erased, and the consequences would ripple through the royal family in ways nobody had fully anticipated. After months of reviews, private meetings, and growing speculation, William had finally moved from preparation to action. The moment many believed would never arrive had suddenly become reality. According to insiders, the future king formally initiated a series of changes designed to redefine the boundaries of influence surrounding the monarchy. For years, discussions about reform had remained trapped inside confidential conversations, carefully shielded from public scrutiny. Now, those conversations had transformed into decisions. The uncertainty that once fueled endless speculation was replaced by something far more powerful: undeniable action. The reaction was immediate. Royal insiders who had spent months debating possibilities suddenly found themselves confronting facts. Some were stunned by the speed, others were shocked by the scale. Even among those who supported William's vision, there was a growing awareness that the consequences would be far-reaching. Long-standing assumptions that had shaped royal life for years appeared to be collapsing almost overnight. The future king had not merely adjusted existing arrangements. He had challenged the idea that those arrangements were untouchable in the first place. For Camilla's family, the development reportedly came as a profound surprise. Many had believed that years of established relationships and accepted traditions provided a degree of protection. That confidence was now being tested in ways few had anticipated. Private conversations reportedly became increasingly emotional as individuals struggled to understand what the changes might mean for their future role within royal circles. Some viewed the decisions as necessary modernization. Others saw them as a direct challenge to relationships that had taken years to build. Regardless of perspective, one reality was becoming impossible to deny. The landscape had shifted. As word of the announcement spread, public interest began accelerating rapidly. Royal observers, commentators, and supporters found themselves asking the same question: why now? Why had William chosen this particular moment to make such a dramatic move? The lack of clear answers only fueled greater fascination. Every rumor seemed to generate another. Every theory produced fresh debate. While the public searched for explanations, those closest to the situation were already dealing with the practical consequences of the changes taking effect. Inside palace operations, staff reportedly faced an intense period of adjustment. Procedures that had once seemed permanent suddenly required reassessment. Expectations changed. Priorities shifted. Long-established routines were reconsidered. What made the transition particularly challenging was that no one knew where the process would ultimately end. If William was willing to challenge these arrangements, what else might be under review? That question echoed through private discussions and strategic meetings alike. At the center of the growing storm stood William himself, appearing remarkably unmoved by the controversy surrounding his actions. According to those familiar with the situation, he believed the monarchy could not successfully move into the future while remaining bound by assumptions inherited from the past. That conviction gave him a level of determination that surprised even some of his closest observers. Critics questioned the wisdom of moving so boldly. Supporters praised the courage required to confront difficult realities. Yet both sides agreed on one thing: this was no symbolic gesture. It was a defining statement about the kind of king William intended to become. With every passing day, questions about influence, access, and authority grew louder. The tension surrounding the changes reached levels rarely seen within royal circles. Old alliances faced new pressures. Private frustrations intensified. Individuals who once felt secure now found themselves confronting uncertainty. And while the announcement itself had already stunned the monarchy, a growing number of insiders feared that the most dramatic consequences had not yet emerged. Yet the announcement itself was only the beginning, because the reactions behind closed doors proved even more dramatic. For those affected by William's decision, acceptance was never going to come easily. Behind the scenes, efforts reportedly began almost immediately to challenge, delay, or reverse the changes. Emotions ran high. Alliances were tested. Relationships that had survived years of royal pressure suddenly faced their greatest challenge yet. But with every attempt to push back, it became increasingly clear that William had anticipated resistance and was already several steps ahead. The announcement may have been decisive, but the battle that followed was anything but quiet. Almost as soon as the changes became known, conversations reportedly erupted across royal circles. Individuals who had once operated with confidence suddenly found themselves searching for answers. Questions came from every direction. Could the decisions be reversed? Was there still room for negotiation? Had William already finalized every detail, or was there an opportunity to influence the outcome? The uncertainty created a wave of anxiety that spread far beyond the individuals directly affected. For members of Camilla's extended circle, the situation was particularly painful. Many had spent years believing their position within royal life was stable and secure. Now they were being forced to confront a reality that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Attempts were reportedly made to preserve existing arrangements through private discussions and appeals to tradition. Some argued that the relationships being questioned had served the monarchy well during difficult periods. Others insisted that loyalty and personal sacrifice deserved recognition. Yet despite these efforts, there appeared to be little sign that William was willing to reconsider his course. As tensions escalated, difficult conversations became unavoidable. Long-standing relationships found themselves under enormous strain. People who had once stood side by side now disagreed sharply over what the future should look like. Supporters of William argued that meaningful reform required difficult choices and that protecting the institution must come before protecting personal interests. Opponents countered that the monarchy risked losing valuable relationships by moving too aggressively. The emotional divide deepened with every passing day, transforming strategic disagreements into deeply personal conflicts. The frustration within affected circles reportedly became impossible to hide. Some individuals felt blindsided. Others felt betrayed. There was a growing belief among critics that years of trust and cooperation were being overlooked in favor of a new vision that seemed determined to break with the past. Yet for every voice criticizing the changes, another emerged defending them. Loyal supporters rallied behind William, praising what they viewed as courage and conviction. They argued that leadership is tested not when decisions are easy, but when they carry significant consequences. That support strengthened William's position and made resistance even more difficult. Meanwhile, palace officials found themselves trapped in the middle of an increasingly complicated struggle. Their responsibility was not to choose sides, but to maintain stability while tensions continued rising. Yet neutrality became harder to maintain as emotions intensified. Every discussion seemed connected to larger questions about power, influence, and the future direction of the monarchy. Every attempt to calm the situation appeared to reveal new layers of disagreement. The atmosphere grew heavier, more uncertain, and increasingly difficult to control. What frustrated William's opponents most was the growing realization that he appeared fully prepared for every challenge. Those who expected him to retreat under pressure were disappointed. Those who believed criticism might weaken his resolve soon discovered the opposite. The more resistance emerged, the more determined he seemed to become. According to insiders, William viewed the backlash not as a reason to stop, but as evidence that change was necessary. That unwavering confidence gradually shifted the balance of the conflict. Then came the moment many had quietly feared. As efforts to preserve old arrangements continued to fail, a sobering realization began spreading through affected circles. Influence that once seemed permanent was fading. Access that once felt guaranteed was no longer secure. The foundations many had relied upon for years were beginning to crumble. And as that realization took hold, the conflict started evolving into something far larger than anyone had originally imagined. As resistance intensified, another revelation emerged that transformed the dispute from a family disagreement into a battle over the monarchy's future identity. Many observers initially focused on who lost influence, but William's supporters argued that the real story was something much larger. According to insiders, this was never simply about individuals. It was about defining the monarchy's future before William ever ascended the throne. The decisions now making headlines were reportedly part of a much broader vision, one designed to reshape royal priorities, restore public trust, and establish a completely different era of leadership. As the controversy continued growing, an important shift began taking place. The public conversation was slowly moving away from personalities and toward purpose. What had first appeared to be a dispute over influence was increasingly being interpreted as a struggle over the monarchy's future direction. William's supporters were particularly eager to emphasize this distinction. They argued that focusing solely on those affected by the changes missed the larger story unfolding behind the scenes. In their view, William was not fighting a battle against individuals. He was attempting to redefine the institution he would one day inherit. According to those closest to his thinking, this vision had not emerged overnight. The plans reportedly stretched back years, developing quietly as William observed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of modern royal life. He had witnessed public support rise and fall. He had watched controversies consume headlines. He had seen how perceptions of fairness and accountability could influence public trust. Those experiences reportedly shaped a belief that the monarchy's survival would depend not only on tradition, but also on its willingness to adapt. That belief would become the foundation of everything that followed. At the heart of William's approach was a growing focus on modernization and accountability. Supporters claimed that he wanted a monarchy that appeared more transparent, more disciplined, and more clearly focused on official responsibilities. To them, the recent changes were not acts of personal hostility, but steps toward establishing a clearer structure for the future. They argued that reducing confusion around influence and privilege would strengthen public confidence at a time when institutions everywhere faced increasing scrutiny. In this interpretation, the controversy was not evidence of instability. It was evidence of transformation. One of the most sensitive aspects of the strategy involved addressing perceptions of favoritism. Whether those perceptions were fair or not was almost beside the point. William reportedly understood that public trust is often shaped by appearance as much as reality. If people believed certain individuals enjoyed special advantages because of proximity rather than responsibility, the institution itself could suffer. That concern reportedly became a driving force behind his efforts. Every difficult decision, every review, and every challenge to existing arrangements reflected a broader determination to place the monarchy's reputation above personal comfort. As these ideas became more widely understood, William's supporters gained confidence. Many believed the backlash would eventually fade once the larger purpose became clear. They pointed to the consistency of his actions as evidence that he was following a carefully developed strategy rather than reacting to temporary pressures. Yet not everyone was convinced. Critics questioned whether the pace of change was too aggressive. Some worried that relationships damaged today might prove impossible to repair tomorrow. Others feared that rapid restructuring could create divisions that linger long after the immediate controversy ended. Those concerns ensured that the debate remained deeply emotional. Supporters saw courage where critics saw risk. Admirers viewed the changes as necessary leadership, while opponents viewed them as disruptive overreach. Yet both sides increasingly recognized that the stakes extended far beyond one family disagreement. The conflict had become a symbol of competing visions for the monarchy itself. One vision emphasized continuity and established relationships. The other emphasized adaptation and reform. The outcome would influence not only current dynamics, but the character of William's future reign. For a brief moment, it seemed as though William was successfully reshaping the narrative. The discussion was becoming larger than personalities. The focus was shifting toward the future. Yet, just as momentum appeared to be moving in his favor, unexpected developments began emerging behind the scenes, threatening to reopen old wounds and create entirely new challenges. But just as William appeared to be gaining control of the narrative, an unexpected development threatened to complicate everything. Every royal conflict eventually reaches a defining moment, and this one was no different. Months of tension, frustration, and unanswered questions converged into a dramatic confrontation that insiders would later describe as unavoidable. Powerful emotions surfaced. Old wounds reopened. Loyalties were tested like never before. Yet amid the chaos, one truth became increasingly difficult to deny. The future king was no longer asking for permission. He was preparing the monarchy for a future built on his own terms. The unexpected developments that had threatened to complicate William's plans did not slow the conflict. If anything, they accelerated it. By this stage, the dispute had grown far beyond questions of influence or privilege. It had become a direct confrontation between competing visions of the monarchy's future. Conversations that once took place in private corners were now impossible to contain. Senior figures found themselves drawn into increasingly intense discussions as pressure mounted from every direction. The atmosphere was charged with uncertainty, because everyone understood that whatever happened next could permanently reshape relationships that had defined royal life for years. The most significant meetings reportedly carried an emotional weight that few could ignore. Individuals who had spent decades working alongside one another suddenly found themselves separated by profound disagreements. Frustrations that had remained hidden for years surfaced with remarkable force. Old grievances returned. Past compromises were re-examined. Long-standing assumptions were challenged. What made these confrontations particularly painful was that they were no longer simply about policy. They were about trust, loyalty, and the future each side believed they were protecting. Every conversation seemed to expose another layer of division that had quietly existed beneath the surface. As tensions intensified, efforts to find common ground reportedly continued. Some hoped that compromise might still be possible. Others believed a temporary solution could prevent deeper fractures. Yet each attempt appeared to encounter the same obstacle. William's position remained remarkably consistent. According to insiders, he listened carefully to concerns, but showed little willingness to reverse course. The future king seemed convinced that retreating now would undermine everything he had spent years preparing to achieve. For supporters, that determination demonstrated strength. For critics, it represented an alarming refusal to bend. Regardless of perspective, the result was the same. The possibility of compromise began fading rapidly. For Camilla's family and their supporters, the realization was increasingly difficult to ignore. Options that once seemed available were disappearing one by one. Appeals to tradition had limited impact. Emotional arguments produced little movement. Attempts to preserve old arrangements struggled against a leadership strategy that appeared firmly committed to change. What made the situation even more painful was the growing awareness that the balance of power had shifted. The assumptions that once provided confidence no longer offered protection. The future was being shaped by a new generation of leadership, and that reality was becoming impossible to avoid. Senior royals reportedly faced difficult choices of their own. Remaining neutral grew harder with each passing week. Some quietly aligned themselves with William's vision, believing that reform was necessary for long-term stability. Others worried about the human cost of such dramatic changes. Every position carried risks. Every decision threatened to strain important relationships. The divisions that emerged were not always public, but they were deeply felt. Behind formal unity existed a growing recognition that the monarchy was passing through a defining moment unlike any seen in years. Outside palace walls, public scrutiny reached extraordinary levels. Every rumor sparked debate. Every development fueled speculation. Supporters praised William as a leader willing to make difficult decisions. Critics questioned whether the pace of change was creating unnecessary turmoil. Yet amid the endless discussion, one perception became increasingly dominant. This was no temporary controversy. Something fundamental was happening. A transition was underway, and its effects would be felt long after the immediate conflict ended. By the time the confrontation reached its peak, a profound sense of finality had settled over the situation. Relationships had changed, expectations had changed. The monarchy itself appeared to be changing. Whether celebrated or criticized, William's actions had accomplished something undeniable. He had demonstrated that the future would not simply be inherited. It would be actively shaped according to his vision, even when doing so carried significant personal and political costs. And when the dust finally began to settle, the true significance of William's first act became impossible to ignore. The story was never just about one decision, one family, or one moment of controversy. It was about the emergence of a future king willing to challenge expectations and reshape the institution he would one day lead. What began as a shocking act evolved into a defining statement of intent. And as the monarchy entered a new chapter, both supporters and critics found themselves asking the same question. If this was William's first act, what could possibly come next? As the immediate tensions slowly began to settle, a larger picture emerged. The controversy that had consumed royal conversations for months was no longer being viewed solely through the lens of conflict. Instead, many observers started examining what William's actions revealed about the future he envisioned. Regardless of where people stood on the issue, one fact had become impossible to deny. The future king had demonstrated a willingness to make difficult decisions even when they carried enormous personal and political consequences. That realization changed the conversations surrounding his future reign almost overnight. The long-term consequences of his actions were already beginning to take shape. Relationships that once defined the balance of influence inside royal circles no longer carried the same certainty. Assumptions that had guided expectations for years suddenly felt outdated. The monarchy appeared to be entering a period where tradition would still matter, but where tradition alone would no longer determine outcomes. William had shown that inherited structures could be questioned, reviewed, and, if necessary, transformed. That message resonated far beyond the immediate dispute and signaled a profound shift in how power might operate in the years ahead. For Camilla's family, the outcome was particularly significant. After months of resistance, appeals, and attempts to preserve established arrangements, many reportedly came to the difficult realization that meaningful avenues for reversing the changes had largely disappeared. The influence they believed was secure had been challenged by a future king determined to chart his own course. What made the situation so dramatic was not simply the loss of influence itself, but the recognition that the broader direction of the monarchy had changed around them. The battle was no longer about preserving the past. It was about adapting to a future they had not expected. Meanwhile, public reaction remained deeply divided, yet endlessly fascinated. Supporters praised William's determination and viewed his actions as evidence of strong leadership. Critics questioned whether such dramatic changes risked creating unnecessary divisions. Yet both sides continued watching closely because they sensed that something larger was unfolding. This was not a temporary controversy destined to disappear with the next news cycle. It was a defining chapter in the story of a future king establishing his authority before formally ascending the throne. That authority appeared stronger than ever by the time the conflict reached its conclusion. The months of pressure had tested William repeatedly. He faced criticism, resistance, and emotional confrontations from multiple directions. Yet through it all, he maintained his position. To supporters, this proved he possessed the resilience necessary to guide the monarchy through future challenges. To opponents, it confirmed that he was prepared to move forward even when others strongly disagreed. Either way, the result was the same. William emerged from the conflict with a clearer sense of authority than he had ever possessed before. Perhaps the most important consequence, however, involved the signals being sent about the future reign itself. The decisions made during this period offered a glimpse into how William might approach leadership as king. Accountability, structure, discipline, and a willingness to challenge established expectations appeared increasingly central to his vision. These principles were no longer theoretical ideas discussed in private. They had been tested under pressure and placed at the center of one of the most significant royal disputes in recent memory. The implications of that shift may extend far beyond the present generation. Future historians, royal observers, and members of the monarchy itself may ultimately view this episode as a turning point, a moment when a future king demonstrated that succession was not merely about inheriting responsibility, but about redefining it. The effects of that choice could influence royal life for decades, shaping expectations for future leaders and altering how the institution adapts to changing times. Yet even after all the debates, confrontations, and dramatic revelations, one question continues to linger. If William was willing to take such a bold step before reaching the throne, what other changes might emerge once he possesses the full authority of a reigning monarch? That uncertainty remains the most intriguing part of the entire story. The conflict may have reached its conclusion, but the future it revealed is only beginning to unfold. Because if this extraordinary decision revealed anything, it is that the most dramatic chapters of William's royal journey may still be waiting just beyond the horizon. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.